Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSPmagazine. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
So hello and welcome to Getting Tech Right, the podcast about ethics and technology. My name is Kevin Macnish, and with me today is Sven Nyholm, Professor of Ethics and AI at the University of Munich. So Sven, hello.
Hello.
I gave you a very, very brief bio there. Do you think you could perhaps flesh that out a little bit? Because I know, I've known you for a while, particularly in the area of ethics and robotics. But you're now Professor of Ethics and AI in Munich, and you've just published a book on ethics and technology.
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to be on the program. I'm a philosopher by background. I did a PhD in philosophy at the University of Michigan, and started from, not the ethics of robotics or AI or anything like that. I wrote a dissertation about Kantian philosophy and the categorical imperative, very, very far from AI and robotics. However, in my very first job, which was as a postdoc at the University of Cologne in Germany, one of my assignments was to every semester teach a course in applied ethics. And so I taught a course on human enhancement, the idea of using technology to improve ourselves, not just to treat problems and illnesses or try to cure us from diseases we might have, but also going beyond the status quo. And that's a very controversial idea within philosophy, but very interesting. And so I sort of got interested in this whole more like, what's technology? What does it got to do with sort of the traditional questions of ethics? I mean, what's a good human life, and where do we want to go to in the future, etc. So I really got into that. And then my second job was in the Netherlands, where we first met working at the Technical University of Eindhoven. Of course, there, it being a technical university, it makes sense to sort of think about issues to do with technology. And one of the things there that was interesting was that people weren't just thinking about technology, they were obviously also creating new technologies, including robots. And the students there have developed soccer playing robots that have performed very well in something called the Robo Cup. Right. They also had a medical care robot that got to meet the Dutch Queen. Most of the staff, myself included, did not get to meet the Queen, but the robots did, and so on. So what I really found, I'm really fascinated by those cases is how the Queen responded to the robot, or how people responded to the soccer playing robots. Actually, I did get to play soccer with those robots, and it's really interesting to interact with something that it looks like a sort of upside down trash can or something like that, but with a little leg sticking out. But once you're interacting with it, you very quickly start treating it as a kind of football or soccer player that you're interacting with. So I really got interested in this sort of human technology interaction and what that might mean for, ideas about, how should we behave towards other people or entities, and how should other people or other entities behave towards us. And so that's sort of the path that led me to the ethics of robotics and AI.
No, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, that reminds me, the soccer playing robot reminds me of a story which I think you share in the book of the Boston Dynamics mule, the sort of vaguely dog-like looking robot that the Boston Dynamics scientists were kicking to show how stable it was. And then the people who responded to that in the sense of, isn't this cruel the way you're treating this robot? Which I think was very, very interesting, seeing people's emotional and intellectual reaction to the way in which we treat robots.
Indeed, yeah. Lots of people, as you said, they said like, "Yo, it's wrong. Don't kick any dog, whether it's a real dog or a robot." Poor Spot, which the name of the robot is Spot. Right. I myself, I got to meet Spot, the robot dog, at an event in The Hague, and there was an experiment where one got to sit in a chair, and Spot, the robot dog, would approach you and stop about 1 meter in front of you, which was actually for me quite unsettling, because it's a little bigger in reality than, you know, those pictures. At least that's the way I experienced it. And having it sort of come directly towards you and stopping right in front of you was actually quite intimidating. So it's, you know, it's one thing to see someone kicking a robot in a video clip, and it's another to have the robot approach you and then feel a little like a predator. So yeah, the whole thing about sort of humans interacting with technologies and the kinds of qualities or properties that we attribute to them, whether or not they have them. And also, you know, we interact with robots and AI with brains and nervous systems and ideas about ethics that developed way before there were any robots or any AI in the world. And so one question is, do we need to update our ideas about ethics and, you know, in order to accommodate the new technological world we live in with AI and robots and all sorts of things that are new to us as a species, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, that's of course one way to go. The other way is to follow, again, as you talk about in the book, Joanna Brysons' approach of saying, let's just not develop AI in such a way that we need to develop our ethics. Let's keep AI and robotics at that slave level.
That's right. Yeah. So she has a very interesting view, because a lot of people say an AI technology, like a large language model chatting with us, or a robot looking like a human, it's always going to be a tool. It can never have any feelings. It can never have any sentience, any emotions, any consciousness. And so, you know, it would never make sense to treat it as anything more than a tool. Bryson has the view that no, it is, at least in theory, possible to build a robot or an AI system that has some sort of consciousness, that has some sort of emotions. And if we did that, then we would have to treat it with the kind of consideration that you should show it to someone that has feelings, that has consciousness, that has thoughts, etc. But that would be very strange, because someone would be owning those technologies. They would be buying and selling them. So it would be a kind of slave, so to speak. It would be working for us and we would be owning it, but it would have feelings and be some sort of person. So in her view, it's better not to go there. Let's keep all technologies, you know, in such a state that you know, we don't have any rights. They don't have any rights. We don't have any obligations towards them.
Yeah. I've got to admit, I'm quite sympathetic to that view myself. I find that quite a persuasive position. But how about yourself? Do you find sympathy with that, or do you think?
Yes, I do. I mean, there could be cases where having the technology be human-like might be one of the things that makes it work the way it's supposed to do. And one example that I sometimes like to bring up is there's a robot called Casper, developed by some researchers, I think in the UK and also in Belgium, I think, working together, but it's based in the UK. And that's a robot that is used as a sort of experimental form of treatment for children with autism, to make them open up and to communicate with strangers. And they find it less overwhelming to start with a robot that looks a little bit like a human. And so in that kind of case, you know, maybe the effect can only be achieved if the robot has human-like features. But on the other hand, there's no need to give it an internal mental life, or you know, it's enough that it pretends, sort of, or like it mimics, you know, human behavior. So yeah, I'm quite sympathetic to the Bryson view, though it's also interesting to note that a lot of people respond to robots and AI and other technologies as if they have those qualities that she thinks that we shouldn't create in them. And so we also have to deal with that sort of case. Lots of people, for example, say that their Replika app is their new best friend. They say they fall in love with Replika, some people, and so on. And so, you know, how do we respect people that have those kinds of feelings towards technology? Should we ridicule them? Should we ignore them, or what? I mean, we should respect them. So how do we best respect them? I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, that comes back to some of your Kantian studies then, way back in the day. About
Absolutely. So like, you know, how do we treat every person as an end in him or herself, you know, in themselves, to use the Kantian phrase, and never as a mere tool. And if it's their, you know, most deep wish and hope to have like the Replika as their best friend, I mean, am I supposed to just ignore their wishes, or am I, in order to treat them as an end, to use the Kantian language, should I respect their wishes and sort of play along, so to speak, or what's the proper way to behave? I think that's actually an interesting and quite complicated question.
Definitely, definitely. So what was it that prompted you to write the book now? You know, a book coming out on technology ethics, on one level, it's very timely, but on another level, it feels like it could, you know, it's going to risk being out of date within about 6 months.
Absolutely. Well, I do have a copy of the book here, so I'll just show that. I don't know if it's going to be a video or just audio, but yeah, the book is called "This is Technology Ethics: An Introduction." Yeah, I mean, there's a series that's called "This is Philosophy," and so there's you know there's the first book in the series is called "This is Philosophy." Then there's one that's called "This is Metaphysics." This is, you know, I don't know, philosophy of biology, etc. And so part of what prompted me to write the book was just that they asked me, would I be interested in writing a book about technology ethics for that series? So that's, in a certain sense, the boring answer to what prompted me to write the book. But on the other hand, I have taught technology ethics before at the university, and there are some really good books out there. Some of them are a little bit dry, and I don't want to go so far as say boring, but I thought, you know, it would be interesting to try to write something that, I mean, maybe some of the readers would find it dry and boring, but the attempt was to write something that would be kind of interesting and fun to read. Lots of interesting examples, like, you know, the soccer playing robots and all sorts of examples along those lines.
Yeah.
And to kind of mix the more theoretical philosophy stuff with your real world examples and you know, interesting anecdotes from the world of technology. And just because, I mean, actually there is quite a demand out there for the ethics of technology. I've noticed the ethics of AI. People find it very interesting, and they are, of course, they're looking for different ways of consuming ideas about this. I mean, what you're doing, I think, is one of the best ways to approach people. I mean, like a podcast or a video or something like that. But people sometimes also want to read something. And definitely there are lots of courses now at the university. Lots of universities are starting to teach the ethics of AI, the ethics of technology, both to people who study ethics anyway, like philosophy students, for example, but also to computer scientists, students, computer science students, or to engineers. I mentioned I worked in Eindhoven before I came to Munich eventually. And back then, all the engineering students at that technical university had to study the ethics of technology. And so I tried to write a book that could be used in such a context, but that could also be enjoyed by people who are more interested in this coming from a philosophical point of view. So it's an interesting challenge to try to write something that could appeal to different audiences. And so those were some of the things that, you know, I also like the idea of writing books. I'm trying to come up with an idea for my next book at the moment. So we'll see.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I've got to say, I enjoyed it. And as somebody like you who's taught engineering and computer science students in the past, the sort of those questions about ethics and technology, for me, it seemed to work, and I would have quite happily used it in that context. And I particularly liked the use of having YouTube clips and TED Talks and so on in your footnotes. I thought that was very powerful. And again, for those people who might find a philosophy book quite dry, to be able to click on those and watch people kicking spot or watch the talk on a particular issue was fantastic, and links to podcasts and so on as well. Sticking with the book then, I found the chapter on ethical alignment and control particularly interesting. Do you think you could say a little bit more about what you mean by, or what is meant by, ethical alignment? And I'm particularly thinking here about the two-level approach that you talk about with Yace and Gabriel, in light of the Stanislav Petrov case. And I'm just throwing all those names out because I know that you'll remember them from having written the book, and you can tell people about what the case was in 1983. I vaguely remembered 1983 myself and how tense issues were. I was living in Germany at the time as part of the British military occupation of Germany, and so it was a very interesting and tense time. But yeah, please talk about that case and then the question about ethical alignment.
Yeah, I mean, I like that case with Stanislav Petrov, partly because when people talk about risks to do with intelligent technology systems, they often imagine a future scenario with a super intelligent sort of robot overlord, threatening us all. But that was back in 1983, as you said, and this was a missile detection system that the Soviet Union was using. to try to see whether the US was sending any atomic weapons their way. And one day the system indicated that indeed an attack had been launched from the US, and 5 basically nuclear missiles were heading towards the Soviet Union. And then the person who was sort of in charge of looking at the monitors and checking the equipment, their instructions was to just like directly report to the superiors and then to start up a counterattack, basically. And if Petrov had followed the protocol and done that, there's a risk. There was a risk that the Soviet Union wouldn't wait until the bombs would strike, but they would try to create a kind of retaliatory strike back and start a nuclear war, basically. But on that particular occasion, Stanislav Petrov thought, well, this might be a false alarm, so let's not follow the protocol, and let's wait and see. And so he didn't follow his orders and didn't report to superiors. And indeed, it was a false alarm, so there was no nuclear attack. But if people had followed, what the technology had been, been instructing them to do on this occasion, and they followed the protocol, then there might have been a nuclear war. And so, in a lot of warning systems, like if you have a smoke alarm, it's really good if it goes off more often than when there's actual smoke. And sometimes even called the smoke alarm effect. That's a good feature. But with this kind of technology, that could mean like a new world war with nuclear bombs going off here and there. So that could be really bad. And so you might think that that's a technology that was not very well aligned with the values and the interests that are at stake in such a situation. And so the whole idea of the alignment of AI or other technologies with human values is to try to have them function in such a way that they live up to the goals, or they help to accomplish the goals that we have for them, and that they don't sort of run counter to what they're meant to do. It could be that some very simple type of a goal is such that there are possible means towards that goal that would be really bad. I mean, if you have a technology that's supposed to remind you to exercise, but it's also able to sort of block out other appointments in your calendar so that you only think about exercise and you might miss an important appointment or whatever. I mean, that's not a very dramatic case, but the whole idea is that especially with self-learning or reinforcement learning type of AI technologies, there's a risk that they would engage in what is sometimes called reward hacking, which is the idea that they're looking around for different ways of solving goals, and they might solve them in what you might think of sort of as perverse ways. And so Jason, Gabriel, and others, they argue that, okay, we have to think about, well, there are two sides to the issue. One, how do we get from a technological point of view, the technologies just do what we want them to do, and to not like solve problems in strange and novel ways from a technical point of view. But then, of course, the question is, well, what goals should there be? Whose goals? Let's say that you and I differ slightly in our values. I mean, it might even be that we have the same values, but we prioritize our values differently. So for you, friends and family is more important than the pursuit of knowledge, or for me, or vice versa, whatever. And so if the technology somehow has to fit with this list of priorities, there might be a difference in what it would do in terms of if it had your list of priorities or mine. But that's just a case where we have the same values, but we rank them differently. Now, what if we have a partial overlap in values, but there's also some values that you have that I don't have, and some values that I have that you don't have? Like, whose values should it be? And sometimes when philosophers and others talk about values, I think they exaggerate the degree of disagreement, especially if you zoom out to a general level. But if you go to a more specific level and the interpretation of different values, and again, something like how do we prioritize our values, then there would be a lot of disagreement. And if we're trying to build autonomous technologies that are supposed to solve problems for us, we really have to have them solve the right problems, but there's also this question about whose problems, and according to whose set of values, according to what list or ranking of priorities. So that's the problem that Gabriel sort of discusses interesting in his work.
It's really interesting, and it puts me in mind of, and again, you'll know this far better than me, the MIT public experiment which they ran on the trolley problem a few years ago over the internet, and they had millions of people respond to it. And one of the things that came out was when you have a choice of who to hit, whether it's an old person or a child, in the West, I think the split was roughly 50-50 as to which way you went. But when it came to China, the choice was very much in favor of hitting the child over hitting the older person, speaking to a culture of respect for age and so on, which we don't have in the West and which is there in China. And that did make me think at the time of, if you have a self-driving car that has these values built into it, as you say, hitting that first level, do the values then change as you cross international borders to the values of the country in which you're now driving, and how would that function? So I think a really interesting challenge.
Absolutely, and that's also a good example of how I mean, both people in the West and people in China would value both young and old people,
of course,
but there may be a difference in terms of, if you had to make a choice, who would you kind of rank higher or lower in your list of priorities. And so I think that's a good example of how people sometimes think, yeah, they have different values in different countries, but it's often more to do in terms of emphasis and thinking about the relations among values.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, absolutely. So, how about control as well? Because I think the area of control generally in philosophy is actually quite underexplored. But I think also with automation, and clearly the question of automation is about, I say clearly, there's a degree to which automation is about handing over control. You know, I no longer control the vacuum cleaner in my house because I just press go on my Roomba, or now I press it on my phone. I don't even have to touch the Roomba, and it goes and does it. So I thought the approach that you talked about in the book from Roman Yampolsky was really interesting there. So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Absolutely. Well, I should first say that I actually think that control is interesting, partly because I think it is something that people do value, but it's not one of those things that when you ask people, can you mention some of your values, they might say, you know, I value justice, or friendship, wisdom, or virtue, or whatever. I mean, that maybe it's like sort of an old-fashioned way of putting things, to say that no one values virtue, but people value being compassionate and being friendly and fair, etc. But very few people would say, like, yeah, I value control. That sounds like you're a control freak, as we say. But on the other hand, when people display something like self-control, we tend to admire them. They have control over an instrument or their own bodies, like a gymnast might have, like Simone Biles or someone like that. We see this as something admirable. And in general, we don't like the idea of losing control. And so this is one of the things that always comes up when people start talking about autonomous technologies, artificially intelligent technologies. Are we going to be able to retain control over them? And Roman Yampolsky, he's a computer scientist, I would say, and a philosopher, because he's quite philosophically inclined, and he writes things about these basic concepts. And one interesting idea is that there seems to be a kind of trade-off between control or controllability on the one hand, absolute controllability on the one hand, and absolute safety on the other. So let's say that direct controllability amounts to a technology always following my orders, so to speak. And so let's say I'm out in my self-driving car, and I say, stop. And there's like some sort of voice control function. Well, if I'm in the middle of the Autobahn in Germany, let's say, I'm driving really fast because people drive really fast there, and the car will just do what I say, stop. Well, I might cause a car crash, and like be a very big problem. And so if I want complete control, direct control, then I might not get safety. If I want complete safety, then I might have to have some sort of, at the most, indirect control. And so he thinks that there's a kind of fundamental trade-off, and you can't have both. And so the question then is, what do you need? Do you need one, or do you need the other? Do you need both, or is there some way of solving this process? And I mean, he treats it as a kind of theoretical paradox. And then just, how can you optimize safety, and how can you optimize control so that you can't have, they can't both be maximized, but what's the right balance to find? And then he's coming up with all sorts of interesting cases to show that in theory, that they seem to be sort of pulling in different directions.
Yeah. No, that's interesting, and tying that back in with what you were just saying about ethical alignment as well. There's not only control versus safety, but also control against other values that we might have. So the car may be pulling us in one direction that we personally would choose not to go in, although the designers of the car did push it in that direction. Do you think that plays in at all? And this is a slightly left field question. For some of the talk around nudge theory and sort of statistical determination. So there's this thing about, most people leave their towels in hotels to get picked up by the maid and washed every day. And then they found if they write 75% of people like you choose not to have their towels washed every day because it saves water and it's good for the environment. And when they do that, far fewer people leave their towels on the floor. And there are some questions then raised, well, have you lost autonomy by that being written for you? Is there a reduction in your control there? Do you think those two areas fit in at all together, or am I just going completely off topic here?
No, absolutely. I agree. I mean, as I said, people tend to value things such as control over oneself, autonomy, and we tend to think, contrary to that if I try to control other people, I mean, we talked about slavery before, and should technology be slaves, so to speak? Should we have complete control over them? Well, if the technologies were persons, or if I'm not interacting with the technology but with another person, and I try to completely control that person to make them just do whatever I want and to not allow them to do what they want and to sort of steer them in every possible way, well, this is one of the most unethical things you can do. I mean, have someone as your slave. Yeah. So if part of having someone as a slave is that you're exercising a form of complete control over them, and nudging is an attempt to kind of control other people, then you can see how nudging could become something very unethical, so to speak, and especially if you then design technologies that would do this in a very subtle way, so that people don't realize that they're being controlled by other people, so that they behave according to whatever patterns they want them to behave. Of course, people who defend nudging will say that, well, it's going to be designed in such a way that there is always a possibility of doing otherwise. No options are blocked out. It's just that you're nudged, you're led gently in a certain direction. But on the other hand, if you're in a very subtle way, manipulating me to act in a certain way, you do seem to have a desire to control me and what I do. And if controlling other people is ethically problematic, then obviously there is a problem here. If it's done for my own good, well, that is nice, perhaps, because there's a concern for my well-being, but on the other hand, there's not a concern for my autonomy. I'm treated as a child. I mean, it's perfectly fine to try to steer your children in the right direction, but at a certain point, you have to let them go, so to speak, and to go off and be autonomous adults, even if that involves making mistakes. And there's another tension here.
And of course, we're back to Kant again with talking about autonomy, or maybe with Mill perhaps in that case, but definitely I think, some really interesting challenges that come up there. And of course, as well, with that dilemma between control versus safety on the individual level with the car, in the case with the towels, you've got control versus environmental responsibility or whatever. And the fact that whether it's a tragedy of the commons situation or something else, where as individuals, we often choose to use our control in a way that is not beneficial for the whole. I can certainly see strong consequential arguments saying that you could make that position that we should be controlling people more, scary as that might be for those of us who risk being controlled. I'm aware, Sven, I think we could probably talk for another 2 or 3 hours quite happily about this stuff, and particularly about your book, which again, I found absolutely wonderful, really enjoyed it. But before we end, is there anything that we've not covered that you would like to add or to talk about?
Well, I mean, obviously, both my book and just like the philosophy of technology itself, there are so many topics that we could discuss, but I think, I just want to mention, I think it's a nice development that more people than just philosophers and others are interested in ethical questions to do with technology. I mean, there seems to be a nice development in the sense that even though there are new problems, there is also a lot of new awareness, I think, of the fact that we should be thinking about these problems. And so I'm optimistic when it comes to the interest that people are showing in the ethics of technology, both in and outside of academia, and both among people who are traditionally interested in ethics and people who are more interested in technology. So I just want to mention that I think that's a nice development, and let's hope that that also leads to a good actual development. That's an open question, but I'm hopeful.
That's good to hear. I think I hear a lot of cynicism in this world, and so that's nice that you're optimistic about it, and that we could be moving in the right direction. And certainly we've got a lot of regulations that are coming out or being called for in this area to try and put some guardrails in place. So things do feel like they're moving in the right direction, but there's always going to be that matter of catch up, isn't there, between the lawmakers and technology development and so on. Well, Sven, it's been an absolute pleasure catching up with you. Thank you ever so much for freeing up the time to talk to us, and I hope to see you again on the program at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot again. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Pleasure. Take care. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and this story made you think, then share ITSPmagazine with your friends, family and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our columns. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.